Let me briefly introduce, for the one or two of you that don't know, Godfrey Boyle. Godfrey, in 1976, started working and teaching at the Open University in Milton Keynes, very early days. And he's today the emeritus professor of alternative or renewable energy? Renewable energy at the Open University in Milton Keynes. He's one of the first times we met was when he started a wonderful magazine called Undercurrents. Does anybody remember Undies, as it was called? Which in fact continued life by merging with Resurgence, as indeed the Ecologist has just done as well. So they're all now together in this one publication. But that Undies was a real start to everybody's awareness about renewable energy. And he's been devising courses ever since. He wrote or co-wrote one of the great Oxford University textbooks on renewable energy, apparently one of the best-selling textbooks in the world in terms of textbooks. So he's really quite an authority, and the other day he and Peter Harper, his colleague from CAT, led the celebrations for 40 years of alternative technology. So there's quite a story to tell. So Godfrey Boyle, over to you.
For that very kind introduction. I've just met, one of the first times I met Nick was when he was running the film tent at a festival I organised in Milton Keynes in 1979. So, plus ça change, plus c'est les mêmes choses. Today I want to just talk in a very brief, only half-hour period, about how, contrary to the impression many people give, how we could in fact power the world's present civilization using renewable energy more or less only, or almost entirely, or entirely. And a lot of people feel that that's not practical and feasible, and I hope to demonstrate that that's not so. I'll be talking about how large the renewable energy resource is, what the case for renewables is, what are the advantages of renewable energy sources, can they really supply the future energy needs of the world, of Europe, of the UK, and what would the costs be, how many jobs would it create, and also just what would a renewable energy future look like. I'll be drawing upon a number of really quite authoritative reports that have come out. Many just recently, one particularly interesting one just came out a couple of days ago. I haven't had a chance to incorporate that yet. But increasingly the volume of reports and research does lend support to the thesis that I'll be making, namely that we can run the world on renewables. Can somebody change me to the next slide?
Oh yes, that's my job.
Nick's the expert finger. Just to, again, I don't want to be too academic about all this, but the key, or one of the main sources of renewable energy is solar power, either direct solar power or indirect solar power. Direct solar power, of course, people are familiar with in terms of solar space heating. Many houses, most houses actually get some of their space heating needs from the sun, because the sun gets through the windows and warms the spaces. There is, of course, consciously devising houses to take better advantage of the solar energy, which is passive and active solar design. There's solar water heating, that's using flat plate panels to heat water. Everybody's pretty familiar with those. I'll be showing some pictures of those later. Then there's photovoltaics, generating electricity from solar power, either directly by solid state devices or using concentrating solar technology, which is something I'll be referring to in a minute. Then there's indirect solar power, one of which, of course, is bioenergy, growing plants which you can burn or generate heat and electricity from. There's wind power, wave power, I'll be illustrating those in a minute. Then there are the non-solar renewable sources, namely tidal power, which depends mainly on the moon's gravitational pull. And then geothermal power, which is heat upwelling from the center of the Earth, caused by mainly radioactivity deep down in the bowels of the Earth's crust, which can be prominent at certain points in the surface of the Earth. That's just a quick rundown of all the different renewable energy sources that there are. Mainly solar, but some direct, some indirect, and some non-solar. Now, what are the sun lasts, which is another 5 billion years, I think, is the next, the time the sun might run out. We've got a fair bit of time left. They improve energy security. We don't have to depend on imports of natural gas from Qatar or from oil from the Middle East. They have lower long-run costs. I'll be coming back to that point in a minute, even though they may at the moment have higher initial capital costs, so that needn't necessarily always be true. And they of course create new green jobs, and that's a point I'll be also coming back to in a minute. So, can we have the next one? By the way, I do very much intend to involve you guys in discussion about all this. You may well want to challenge me in any or every point I've made, and I'll be happy to respond to the extent that I can to any questions you may have in 20 minutes or so when I've finished. So Nick, okay, well this is just illustrating some of the sources I was referring to earlier. There's passive and active solar space heating and cooling of buildings. I forgot to mention cooling, which is important in some climates. Solar water heating, like the type of water heating you can see on the right here. And solar electricity, providing the electricity for buildings. This is one in Northumberland, and a rather stylish looking building at Doxford. Photovoltaics is an energy source that's getting very much cheaper than it was even a few years ago. It's becoming quite attractive and almost competitive with conventional sources, depending on, of course, how you choose to do the sums. This is concentrating solar power. This is not particularly applicable to the UK, but in sunny countries like southern Spain or parts of the New Mexico desert in America and the Middle East, there are two different types. One is these parabolic troughs, which concentrate on the solar energy on pipes running up the middle. Those parabolic troughs track the sun as it moves through the sky, and they generate high pressure and high temperature steam, which can then be used to drive an engine, which can produce both electricity and heat. Then the power tower is a similar principle, except that it involves a whole huge array of mirrors that focus the sun's rays on a very small focal point, the central receiver as it's called, in the middle, which reaches very, very high temperatures indeed and produces steam to drive a turbine generator. And you can also, of course, use the heat if there's a place to harness the heat nearby. But a further advantage of the power tower technology is that you can store the heat over a fairly long period of time using salts, which enable energy to continue to be produced even at night, which is something which most solar energy sources don't do. And this is a site in southern Spain, in Andalusia, I think it is. Okay, can we have the next one? I hope I'm not running too quickly through all this, but we intend to have. Am I going too quickly? Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
right.
Sorry, I'm slow by nature.
Well, no, it's just that I've got limited time slot. We can come back on things. I thought this is a bit of fun. I recently visited the Enercon wind turbine factory in northern Germany, and they have a wonderful tower top observation platform there, and you can see. And can you press play, Nick? This is actually a little video that I shot myself. Oh no, not that one. Can you go back? I think you just have to click. Can you go back? Yeah, click on the middle of the picture and it'll probably play. Oh no, not that one. Oh, no. Go back a bit. If you just click and no. Use the mouse. Use That's it. Click there. Click there. That's it. Okay. Oh no, you stopped it. Yeah, click on that arrow.
The mouse is a bit light-hearted.
Shall I do it for you?
No, it's just it moves very, very quickly.
High speed.
Really, high-speed mouse.
Yes.
Good God, where's he gone?
No,
Let me try that one.
I think. Oh no, that's the next one.
The space bar.
Shall I do it?
Oh, yeah.
Let me do it.
There he is.
Needs woman's touch.
That should. Yeah, that's it. You just click on there. That's it. Okay.
Oh, it's in the turbine. Wow.
This is what you see when you're at the top of the tower. These are the blades going past the window. This is a 1.6 megawatt machine, about I think 70 or 80 meters diameter, of the type that, as you can see in a minute, are very common in Germany. Germany has a far, far bigger installed base of wind turbines than Britain, and they don't seem to cause the hysterical objections that you find in Britain all over the place. I mean, I'm not arguing that one should put wind turbines everywhere at all, but there certainly are plenty of places where they can be put without any major problem, I think, although you may want to challenge me on that point. I think that's nearly it. Okay, so can we quickly fast forward to the next slide, Nick? That may have not. Oh, yeah, oh, not that one. That one. Okay. Now this, I'm showing this also because It illustrates two things. I'll be talking in a minute about Denmark. Denmark's one of the most advanced countries in developing renewable energy, aiming for 100% by 2050. But I was at the Copenhagen Climate Conference a couple of years ago, and I shot this video in Copenhagen Harbour, and it shows the offshore wind farms, which actually are owned by a cooperative, believe it or not, in the harbour of Copenhagen. But also in the background, there's the Arvidor combined heat and power plant, which provides both electricity and heat for the city of Copenhagen, and which is partly or largely fueled by biofuels. If you go in there, you see these huge bales of straw being fed into the boilers to provide the heat that raises the steam for the turbines that provides the electricity. You know, we're having troubles.
You want to run it?
Yeah, could you run? Sorry, yeah. Oh no. Oh dear, we're going far too far ahead.
The one?
If you click in the middle of the picture, it usually works.
Click in the middle of the picture?
Yeah, click in the middle of the picture. And that's it. Then you get the forward. There we go, that's it. These are the, actually there's not very much wind that day, but they're normally a bit faster than that. But just illustrates that these things are for real. And these are actually by modern standards fairly small turbines. The offshore turbines that are being installed off Britain today are quite a bit bigger than that, probably about at least twice the diameter. Anyway, I thought it would be nice for you to see the reality of renewable energy, both wind power and biofueled combined heat and power in an actual city in an advanced country, namely Denmark. Can you fast forward? Okay, this is another totally different type of renewable energy. Tidal energy is actually, as I was saying, mainly caused by the gravitational pull of the moon, but a little bit from the sun on the Earth's oceans. But at certain parts of the, particularly around the UK, there are areas where the tidal currents are concentrated. And one of these places is the Strangford Narrows in Northern Ireland, in Strangford Lough. And in those narrows, for quite some time now, there have been these two submerged tidal current turbines. They're a bit like submerged wind turbines. And they've been operating extremely successfully for the last, I think it's at least 5 years, possibly 10, in an experimental project. The company that set that up, Marine Current Turbines, in fact, is run by someone who was involved in intermediate technology many years ago, Peter Frankel. Some of you here might know him. That company has now been taken over by Siemens, the big, huge electrical company. Whether you regard that as a good thing or a bad thing is something we could discuss. Whether renewable energy ought to be the subject of huge corporations or not is, we can discuss that. Oh yes, and the bottom right picture shows the marine current turbine lifted up from the sea for maintenance in the loch. You can see the turbines, it's not a very good picture, have been lifted up from the seabed. On the left, there's one of the many wave energy devices. Now, wave energy involves capturing, of course, the waves, and it works best in a fairly vigorous wave climate. This is called the pilamus, which means sea snake, and the way it works is the waves move different. It's a series of articulated cylinders with hydraulic rams in between them, and the waves move different parts of the device relative to one another, and the relative movement drives hydraulic motors that generate, coupled to generators that generate electricity, if you're with me. And it may seem a rather roundabout way of doing things, but the strength of the pilamus is that it's very able to survive very, very severe wave climates. Because one of the problems with wave energy is you've got too much of it a lot of the time. In really, really severe conditions, the waves would just destroy many devices, and this has been designed to try to get around that problem. Can we have the next one? Okay, I thought I'd just show how rapidly renewable energy, how much it contributes to world needs at the moment, and how rapidly it's growing. As you can see, the total of renewable energy to world energy requirements is about 16–17% at the moment, of which a lot of it is still traditional biofuels, just people burning wood and stoves like the ones we see all around here today. Often very unhygienically and unsafely, as I'm sure many people here will know. Burning wood in confined environments can lead to very severe respiratory diseases, and it's not a very healthy thing to do. But the modern biofuels are, modern renewable energy sources are mainly solar photovoltaics, wind power, concentrating solar power, geothermal, hydro. Well, hydro, of course, I didn't mention hydropower because everybody sort of knows about that. It's the big, again, somewhat controversial renewable energy source. Very benign in small scales, but often rather malign in places like the Three Gorges Dam in China, where many millions of people have had to be cleared away and where all sorts of other adverse environmental consequences have ensued. But I just wanted to illustrate the growth rates of renewable energy over the last. The grey bars are the 5-year averages, and the yellow bars are the growth rate in 2011. So as you can see, renewables is growing very fast, to my delight. Maybe yours too. Can we have the next one? Okay, now this is, I'm beginning to address the question that I set myself at the beginning, namely, can renewables power the world? Well, actually, did I have a previous slide? Is there a previous slide, Nick? I think it's in the wrong order. Is there one after this? Oh, hang on a minute. Okay, well, in that case, sorry, go back. Yeah. Previous. Okay. There's a popular article in Scientific American, you might have seen it a couple of years ago, by these two Stanford University academics, showed how we could provide the world's power demand by 2030, named anywhere between 11 and 17 terawatts. Those who know what a terawatt is, won't need me to explain it. It's could be supplied by very large numbers of wind turbines, large numbers of rooftop solar systems, concentrating solar power plants, water turbines and tidal turbines in particular, wave plants, hydro plants, geothermal plants, and those may seem horribly daunting numbers, and they are backed up by a refereed journal publication, Energy Policy. But of course, as they themselves in the papers point out, the world's production of just cars and light trucks alone is 73 million a year. So there is the industrial capacity there to produce these large numbers, these large quantities of hardware, if we chose to harness that capacity in that way. Okay, next one. Now this is another study that came out from WWF, Worldwide Fund for Nature, a couple of years ago, just a year ago I think. And again they show how the world could be 95% renewable by 2050 by a combination of winding down energy demand by aggressive energy saving and electrification measures, and then powering up the various renewable sources and phasing out oil, coal and gas. This study wasn't just done by a bunch of sort of hand-waving environmentalists, it was backed up by, I plead guilty to that myself perhaps, but that it was, the detailed analysis was done by a very reputable consultancy called Ecofis, based in the Netherlands, and they do know what they're talking about, and they've crunched the numbers pretty rigorously. Again, I mean, there isn't time to go into huge detail on all this. You're welcome to check all the site for yourselves. All of this is on the web, pretty easily accessible. You can see that by 2050, about 95% of the world's energy is coming from renewables under that scenario. So it does show that it's possible. Now this is a third scenario from Greenpeace. They call this the energy revolution scenario. And in this particular one, renewables provide 80% of demand by 2050. And again, the white bar shows energy efficiency. This is comparing, on the left hand you've got the reference scenario, which is what the conventional energy analysts predict. And on the right hand bars are the revolution scenario, showing how by 2050 we could phase out coal and nuclear and oil and natural gas and phase in hydro, wind, biomass, geothermal, solar thermal, ocean energy, and make the difference up by improving the efficiency. Because again, I don't know whether people need convincing of this, but the efficiency with which we use energy in our present civilization is appalling. There's waste all over the place, which could be easily mitigated at almost no cost, and sometimes even negative cost. So we don't do it because we're often too lazy to put the effort in. I speak for myself as well. I'm not claiming to be without sin in this department myself. Okay, again, Greenpeace have done a rather interesting study that shows in its essence that although this energy revolution scenario of theirs would cost a bit more in terms of its capital costs, it would cost something like $17.9 trillion compared with business as usual, which would be $11.2 trillion. But they show in a part of the study, I haven't got room to illustrate, that the renewable scenario would save much more in fuel costs over the 20 or 30 year period. So although the initial capital costs is higher, the savings in fuel massively outweigh that. And that's true of many renewable sources. It takes they often cost more, but then they save money in the long run because of the lack of fuel bills. All you've got is maintenance. And then of course they also show that in this energy re-evolution scenario, worldwide it would create something like 8 million extra jobs by 2030. And again, you can look these studies up on the web if you like. The Greenpeace website's got them. Now, moving now to the United Nations Environment Programme, which did a green economy report a few years ago in 2000, well, just 1 year ago, 2011, which first of all pointed out that people criticise renewables for being subsidised, but in fact the subsidies to fossil fuels in terms of tax breaks and grants and so on are massively greater than those to renewables. There's something like 500 to 700 billion a year, and the UN calls that inefficient and wasteful. Whereas the support to renewables in 2009 was only 57 billion. And given that also the point that people often forget about renewables is that the monetary costs don't include so-called externalities, the pollution caused by the waste that gets put into oil spills and air pollution that causes deaths and so on. So the externalities, which are often very hard to cost, but should be costed somehow, are not included in these calculations. So renewables save you even more than is evident from these sorts of figures. So renewable energy presents major economic opportunities, and countries like Germany and Denmark are beginning to discover that, as we'll see in a minute. Britain has been very slow at grasping these opportunities, even though Britain has one of the best wind and wave resources in the world, really. And we could have been in the lead in wind power in the 80s and 70s, but Denmark forged ahead, and we decided to concentrate on other things like nuclear power instead. And the report, anyway, suggested that the world should invest about 2% of world gross domestic product to build a green economy. And whether that happens or not is another matter. Next one. Oh yeah, now this, I'm getting down to individual countries now. This is a scenario showing how Germany proposes to get 50% of its electricity from renewables by 2030, quite soon. This is from the ministry now, not just a green group that you might expect to be over-optimistic. I mean, I won't dwell on the details of this, but you can see that it involves, wind power, hydropower, wind offshore, biogas, photovoltaics, and geothermal. There are similar scenarios for France, Spain, India, Finland, and Turkey. Can I have the next one? Now, this is an attempt very quickly to answer the question: what do we do when the wind doesn't blow? Well, basically, it's you have a mixture of renewables, and also you have forecasting. The electricity grid is a very sophisticated system which involves, even without renewable energy, balancing demand and varying supplies from nuclear, gas-fired, oil-fired hydropower stations already. And in Germany they have an experiment called the combined power plant, which illustrates how you can combine all the renewables and run the energy system in Germany on virtually all renewables. And the story behind this, which I haven't really got time to go into, is that apparently Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, she asked the renewable energy system she said, show me how this can be done. And the people who at I've forgotten the name of the name's gone out of my head, the institute in Germany. No, it wasn't the Fraunhofer. Well, there was many Fraunhofer institutes. It'll come back to me in a minute. They did this study showing how it can be done. This is a 1/50th scale. So I've cut out some of these slides to cut down on time. This is I think it's a 100th scale model of energy in Germany, and showing how renewables can meet it on a 100th scale, and therefore could be done on a larger scale. A lot of it is to do with forecasting. The technology of forecasting what the wind will be in 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours is getting very sophisticated now, particularly if you spread the wind turbines over a large area. We'll come to that point in a minute. So it's not the showstopper that people say that wind is a variable resource and that solar is a variable resource. Okay, next one. Oh yes, now this shows how the Danish authorities show how they propose to get all of their energy from renewables by 2050. this is from both the Danish Climate Commission and the Danish Society of Engineers. Again, in Denmark, the engineering profession seems to be far more advanced and ecologically minded than some of our engineers here. And so they've really set to with a vengeance and created this picture which you can see of how they propose to get all of Denmark's energy from wind, solar PV, thermal, biofuels, heat storage, some geothermal, etc., etc. You can see for yourselves, perhaps some wave power too. Okay, how are we doing for time? Not too bad. Now, this is another study which I was very peripherally involved with, Zero Carbon Britain. In fact, is Toby Kellner here? Yeah. Ah, Toby, right, you can say something about this in a minute. He's, well, to say, effectively it showed how by a combination of powering up and powering down, Britain could achieve a zero carbon future by 2030. But it would involve a very, very large amount of offshore wind, as you can see it from this diagram. 33 gigawatts is the amount that the current UK government plans to install by 2030, or 2020 rather. And the Zero Carbon Britain is for 195 gigawatts, which is a huge amount. So that, whether that's realistic or not, we could discuss. And Toby is running a workshop later this evening, 5 o'clock,
today in the
where you can have a go at seeing what would happen if you put a wind farm here and a wind farm there and a solar farm here and a solar farm there. And well, I won't preempt the conclusions, but
if you want to power the country yourself, if you don't work it out how you would do it,
come to Toby's workshop. Is there? I mean, do you want to say more on Zero Carbon Britain in the short time we've got? Or?
I'll let you talk.
Okay, well, anyway, just to say, there's been a new tranche of funding for Zero Carbon Britain, and Toby's working on it. I'm somewhat involved in it as well, and we're hoping to produce an hourly model simulating the variation of demand on an hour-by-hour basis and of supply on an hour-by-hour basis. And Toby is the gee-whiz modeler, and I'm looking over his shoulder. We hope to have an even more persuasive case than this report in a year or two's time, which, whether anyone takes any notice of it is another matter, but we shall see. There are other studies. I've cut that from the slide because of time, but the WWF, the World Wide Fund for Nature, did a UK report, not the World one I showed a minute ago, with very, very similar conclusions that Britain could provide the vast majority of its electricity from renewables by 2030, was it, Toby, I think? 2030, yeah. So, okay, press on. Oh yes, now this shows another illustration of what we're sitting on in terms of resource in the UK. There's a study called the Offshore Evaluation, produced a couple of years ago, which focused on the fact that the UK is incredibly fortunate for having this enormous offshore resource, mainly of wind, but also of tidal and wave power. And in particular, if you start going way offshore, too deep to install foundations easily into the seabed, you can start having floating wind turbines, and this is an example of one built by Statoil, the Norwegian company. It floats, but it's guided by guy wires to the seabed. And if you have floating wind turbines way off many tens or even hundreds of kilometers out into the sea, not only do you get a much bigger resource, but also there's an awful lot more of it because you can harness a much larger area. Of course, you've got to transmit the power back to the shore. But if you take that into account, the UK's offshore wind and wave resources at least as big as the offshore oil and gas resource that we've almost run out of. So we are doing something to harness it, but we're not doing anything like enough in view of the sheer magnitude of it. Carry on. Oh yes, now moving to the European scale, this is a study from the European Climate Foundation that showed how there were various scenarios of how Europe could move towards anything between 40 and 100%. Can you go back? Renewables by 2050, showing how the different sources could be, the fossils again phased out and renewables phased in. And this was again done by quite reputable consultants, McKinsey's and Imperial College and Oxford Economics. Another of theirs, can I have the next one? This also from their study shows how if you can combine the demands for energy across Europe, and I'll be coming to how you do that in a minute, you can almost not see the grey lines. The grey lines are the jiggly up and down demand of individual countries within the EU, and the green line is what happens when you average all those out over time. The top graph is over a year, and the bottom graph is over a day, so that you can see averaging the hugely varying demand of individual European countries over a day or a year becomes an awful lot smoother if you average it out over the whole of Europe. We're coming to how you might do it in a second. Can we have the next one? This also shows how in Europe, in the summer there's a lot more solar energy around, as you might expect, and again in the winter there's a lot more wind energy, and the two complement each other quite well. And we still have perhaps a bit of coal and gas at the bottom if you want to do that. And then finally, can I have the next one? This is how a lot of people are proposing we combine the supplies and demands across Europe. The proposals for a European supergrid, as it's called, it's really beginning to be built now. There are new ones announced in the last few weeks, new links. So the idea is that there will be a supergrid that would link large wind and wave farms in the North Sea with concentrating solar power plants in North Africa and southern Spain, and some geothermal and biofuel plants in the middle, and lots of photovoltaics around. And then there would be not just supergrids, but microgrids and mini-grids for cities and towns using smaller scale sources of solar and wind and biofuels. You can pick up the details. The details are very clear on that slide, I'm afraid, but you get the general idea. An interlinked network of supergrids, smart grids, mini grids and microgrids, all intelligently linked. Of course, you can do that now with the new information technology devices that are at our disposal that weren't 50 years ago when the old-fashioned grid that we now use was built. Next one. This is another vision, a somewhat similar vision, but from a different source. This is from the Desertec Industrial Consortium, which includes very large companies in Germany, and they're extending it right to North Africa and across to the Middle East. A huge supergrid, the Desertec supergrid, which would provide electricity not just for Europe but for the Middle East and North Africa, linking up all these different sources. And there's some really quite serious companies working on this now. Although whether the present turmoil in the Middle East is favourable to this or not is possibly a bit of a moot question. Next one. And then again, this is just a very quick glimpse of what it would look like in the renewable energy future with low energy buildings. Of course, energy buildings designed to consume a lot less energy than they do at the moment, which is relatively easily done for new buildings, and even for older buildings isn't too difficult. Then roofs and facades producing both heat and electricity, local combined heat and power plants like the one I was referring to at Labrador in Denmark. And then next one. Oh yes, now moving to the end now. I'm not under any illusions that creating this renewable energy future would be easy, because there are in fact quite strong vested interests that strongly resist the moves in this direction. And I don't know if I need to quote, I enjoy quoting Machiavelli. There's nothing more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. The innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new. This coolness arises partly from fear of the opponents who have the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men and women, who do not readily believe in new things until they have long experience of them. And that's probably just as valid now as it was 400 years ago, 500 years ago. Now, but to not end on an entirely pessimistic note, let me have the next one. Now, to summarise, the renewable energy potential is enormous. We have got the technology, it could be improved a bit, but it's already mostly there. The costs are moderate and coming down. The need is imperative, not least from climate change, but job creation, green economy and so on. The benefits are enormous, as I was saying, in lack of pollution, etc., satisfying work, local self-reliance, resilience, etc. But a strong political commitment is required, and only really in countries like Denmark and Germany is that evident at the moment. But I take some heart from Gandhi's famous saying. He didn't say this on the famous Salt March, but if you'd been in India when the British Empire was at its height, you wouldn't really have believed that India would achieve its independence as quickly as it did. And Gandhi's maybe not the only actor, but he played a huge part in this. And you know, his saying that first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win, is I think as valid now as it was then. So let's have your views. Thank you very much.
Godfrey, thank you very much. I'm sorry about the delays on.
Yes,
oh, could you push it back?
Oh, yes, yeah. Could you, just close the lid. That's
oh yeah,
easy.
close the lid.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
So how are we doing?
So wonderful. How are we doing for time?
It's quarter past. Yeah.
Quarter past. So we've got about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I hear rumours that the Germans are sort of cutting back on their renewables. Now, I haven't heard anything very specific, and I don't know whether it's simply that they're cutting down their feed-in tariffs because they've actually done their job. But I keep hearing rumours that the Germans are beginning to find it too expensive and they're rethinking their whole policies and so on. Is this true, or is it just something which vested interests put out?
You've almost answered the question in in fact, the short answer is I don't know. I mean, I keep hearing these reports as well, and I can't work out whether it's just certainly the big energy companies in Germany have always been very resistant to this green future, particularly the fossil and nuclear fuel ones, and they do seem to lose no opportunity to cast aspersions on the green scenarios that have been put forward. But it is also true that the Germans are cutting down on the feed-in tariffs, but then that was always envisaged. I mean, the costs have been coming down anyway. And I think unlike our government, they have been reducing the feed-in tariffs in a way that more or less, I might be wrong about this, matches the reduction in costs that has been happening anyway. So that's not a showstopper. And certainly, I've got the figure somewhere, but the rate of installation of solar PV in Germany is still very, very high. I mean, astonishing. Way in a month, I think they install more than we've installed here altogether. I mean, it's far, far higher. So I don't have a definitive answer to your question, but I think one must be aware of the propaganda battles that are going on all the time. And of course, if Angela Merkel were to lose the election to some government that was much more unsympathetic to renewables and sympathetic to fossil fuels and nuclear, then that might change the picture a lot. So, yeah, the battle, if you call it a battle, I don't think it's been won in Germany. At least there's only a temporary victory, perhaps. I'm not sure that doesn't really answer your question, but I'm not sure that I can.
Anybody else? Yes, there.
Yeah, just a question specifically about, well, I guess I know it applies to the Zero Carbon Britain report, which is they didn't include estimates of the amount of natural resources such as copper, rare earth metals and other natural resources needed to build this huge infrastructure just for the UK. And the question is, are these more recent reports that are grander in scale, looking at Europe and the whole world converting, are they taking natural resources into account? That's the question.
Well, okay, I think in the case, again, Toby might correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Zero Carbon Britain report did not address that specific question. However, there's the report I quoted from the Stanford University academics, the one projecting the world's energy needs by 2030 that I first showed. They did include it, they highlighted that there could be shortage of molybdenum and some rare earth metals. But again, I read a bit about that, and of course, the amount of these metals available depends an awful lot on price and whether the Chinese will free up their resources or not. So it's a bit of a movable feast, but certainly I think the answer is the Zero Carbon Britain report didn't address that question, but other reports have done. And I think that it could be a short to medium term problem, and I don't think it would be a long term problem.
I really like the comparison with the car industry because I'm sure they're producing a lot more material that could be equally gone into that. So thanks a lot.
Yes. I mean, I think, we could. Yes, I haven't looked into that specific problem recently, but I know that particular report, and particularly the refereed journal reports that followed it up, do look into it, and they highlight that some rare earth metals could be a problem. So you're partly right.
Thanks.
Toby?
Just quickly on the Zero Carbon Britain did sort of an order of magnitude comparison about the amount of steel that would be required for those turbines compared to the overall thing, and while they didn't analyze in detail, it was like it would only be a relatively small fraction of like the total.
Yes.
On the rare earth stuff, at least the rare earth used for magnets in wind turbines, that actually very often is overstated in terms of you don't need those magnets.
Yeah,
And in
you
fact,
can use
very few
ferrite.
turbines. Well, you can simply use coils, for example. I mean,
Exactly, that's right.
most
They can be
most
electromagnets,
wind
yes.
turbines up to date actually are electromagnets. There's advantages, especially offshore, to having permanent magnets, and then neodymium would be good. But it's not that you can't do it. I think if there is a bottleneck, probably lithium for rechargeable. If you say you electrify all transport, then lithium and maybe magnets in cars is probably the bigger bottleneck. With wind turbines, it's very often overstated.
That's a good point. Yes, right. Thanks, Tony. Oh, there's another one. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. The similar question that was asked of Adam Hart-Davies in the previous talk, which is the sort of the logic of the huge Europe-wide smart grids and so on versus the logic of small is beautiful. How do you sort of reconcile?
Well, in fact, I find it very hard to reconcile those views. I was just having a sort of half-joking conversation with Toby about this earlier, and I think I have with some reluctance I say this. I mean, in the Zero Carbon Britain report, it proved necessary in order to make the thing work, to have quite large offshore resources which would be coming from large wind turbines. Maybe not necessarily the European supergrid, but I find it hard, even though it kind of goes against my instincts, to see how you can do it all with small-scale stuff. I certainly think we ought to have a lot of small, and a variety of scales. Not just, I mean, small covers a whole range of things. It's small, medium, large. But I do think you're probably going to need a fair bit of the large too. I mean, whether we like it or not. And I'd rather that was, I mean, like the Copenhagen wind farm owned by a cooperative rather than by some anonymous multinational. But, well, that's a different battle.
Yes?
What do you see as the role of energy storage within all this, and where are the best and most credible places to do that?
Yes, well, I think a couple of answers to that. I mean, a lot of people have the erroneous impression that you need energy storage because of the variability of wind and sun. And I've tried to show that if you have a grid like the present one that we have, a recent study showed that up to about 30% or more of our power could come from variable renewables. With the grid as it presently is, it's already quite happily used to adjusting up and down to the inputs from different sources. So the need for storage is often exaggerated. However, if we were to go to an all renewables electricity future, then you might start needing more storage and or interconnection to the international supergrids that I was talking about. And there's a lot of work going on in flow batteries. We already have some storage, as you know, in Norway and in Scotland. The UK doesn't have all that much of that. There are some people working on new storage concepts. A lot of them are quite away from being products you can buy off the shelf. There's also potential for storage in that if we start having large numbers of electric vehicles, then there can be storage overnight in their batteries. So I think that the need for storage is often exaggerated, but would become important in 10 or 20 years or more when we have loads and loads of renewables, as I hope we will. And then it becomes more of a problem. And I don't think the solutions, certainly an economic solution, is not quite there yet.
Can you
again,
cut the cost of the links, though, from each individual peaky producer by having decent energy storage there and make the link back cheaper?
Yes, that would be one thing. Although I think in terms of the actual links, given that we already have a grid in the UK, and also the transmission losses in the UK grid, people often don't realise are quite small. I mean, it's only about 8% lost from transmission to consumption in the UK. So whether the economics would stack up in favour of what you're saying or not, I couldn't say off the top of my head, I'm afraid. I mean, it might be that you're right, and it might not, I don't know. Happy to confess my ignorance on many subjects.
Could I ask for a prediction? I mean, we could obviously, in theory, get to 100% renewables for the whole world by 2050, but how far do you think we'll really get? What's most likely?
Yes, good question, dear. I suppose, all right, well, I just showed that we're getting sort of 17% from renewables at the moment, and there are studies that we could go to say 80-90% by 2050. Well, split the difference. So we say 50% by 2050? I mean, you're asking me to stick my neck out, and that's what I'm doing. But I think that things are moving in that direction. I mean, nuclear power is kind of in the doldrums anymore. I'm not convinced that it will expand the way its advocates say it will. Fossil fuels are, well, you can argue about whether they're really running out, but if you're ruthless enough to start exploring in the Arctic, maybe they won't, you know. I don't myself, I'm not happy about that at all. So I think we will be turning more and more to renewables. Whether it'll be 100% by 2050, as it could be, I don't know. But I mean, if you ask me to hazard a guess, I'd say 50%. 50% of primary energy, not just of electricity. I mean, people again often make the mistake of confusing electricity with energy. The two are not necessarily the same at all.
And if we get that far, will that be good enough for global warming?
Ah, yes. Well, probably not quite. Well, it depends a bit on what we do in other ways. Possibly, I can't remember the answer to that off the top of my head, but probably not. Can I talk about that afterwards?
Toby, I think, did Toby have something to say on that?
Yeah, Toby, do you think that would be enough to, if we had 50% of the world's energy coming from renewables by 2050, would that be enough to cut emissions?
No,
It probably
well,
wouldn't be enough.
Definitely a country like Britain, if you look at it from any fairness perspective, would have to go a lot further because we need to still allow other countries to even grow.
Oh, that's right,
It's
yes.
more difficult. But I actually wanted to ask along similar lines, sort of, you know, would you think if we say, well, actually realistically we can ever only reach 50, 60, 70%, is it worth it, in your opinion? Is renewables something where we say, you know, every 1% gives us a benefit, or are we saying, well, actually if we ever only get to half, we still require fossil fuel imports or nuclear, we still actually, you know, will have a lot of carbon emissions. Is it worth putting the Welsh countryside full of pylons and wind turbines? Or are we saying, if we think 100% isn't possible, it's not worth bothering?
Well, I mean, you're putting it rather pejoratively. It doesn't necessarily mean putting the Welsh countryside full of wind turbines. You could have it, or they'd be offshore, wouldn't they? Perhaps.
Probably a lot of both.
Well, there'd be some, but I mean, I don't go along with the idea that if you had lots of wind turbines, they need necessarily be an eyesore. There are places where you could put them.
Toby, we could put them all in Northern Ireland, his country.
Well, there are plenty there already. So, well, I'm not sure if I have a strong answer to that. It might or might not be worth it. Again, it depends on what your values are. I mean, you know, what do you think? What does society value? What does it not value? You know. No, sorry.
One of the big issues with switching to renewables is the cost, as you've talked about, with the changing from a capital intensive to a running cost intensive model. The fossil fuels being a running cost and renewables being cut. So that's a huge burden on the generation that makes that change.
Yes.
You're talking about offshore and wave and onshore in the same category. I'd just like to point out I work for an onshore wind farm developer, Wind Prospect. The cost of onshore wind farm development in this country is comparable over a 20-year period with the fossil fuel generations. It's a lot cheaper than nuclear by far, and it's the cheapest renewable that there is.
Sure.
Offshore is really happening, but it costs about twice as much.
That's right.
It costs a lot more than all the fossil fuels. And wave power is what 20 years away from
exactly.
really
Wave's not really
being happening. So you know we don't want to ruin the Welsh countryside, but today onshore in serious onshore and solar are our only options.
No, I think we should be developing onshore wind judiciously where it's not causing it. But in fact, a slight answer, possible answer to your point about offshore wind is that I bet you, I haven't got the numbers in my head, but I bet you when offshore oil exploration started in Britain in the 1970s, I bet you the costs then were very high. I mean, the oil was coming out of the ground, but you know, people didn't really. It was the British National Oil Corporation. It was done by. Anyway, some of it was done by state-owned companies.
Yeah.
You know, the investment was put in, and the costs presumably went down as you got better at it. And surely that will happen with offshore wind as well.
I mean, the problem is they're competing with these with effectively selling off capital.
Well, exactly.
Of the fossil fuels. So that's a major
but again,
issue.
well, maybe it's a matter of societies. I mean, at the moment, society is driven by very short-term economic considerations, which shouldn't really be the main drivers, but they are. And when that's the case, then that's difficult. I agree.
I think we're getting, unfortunately, to the point where there's another speaker starting in a few minutes, and to be fair, we probably ought to call it to an end, although we probably could go on quite a while.
Or we can discuss in Toby's workshop if you want to.
Ah, right. Toby, your workshop's what time?
It's at 5 o'clock. It's in the straw circle.
5 o'clock in the straw circle.
And it's going to be about realistically how can we power a country like this size on renewables, and what would that look like?
So yes, he'll have the sobering real answers.
So can we give a huge thanks for one of the best informed talks yet?